All right, this is a continuation from the lecture in class. We started looking at an introduction to agriculture, and the slide that I was able to get to for most of you guys would be onto the three agricultural revolutions. So let's take a look at the first agricultural revolution. This occurs first in what we think would be the Middle East, so Mesopotamia, Iraq, Kuwait, probably about 10,000 years ago after the thaw of the last ice age. We have two things that kind of happen in this area. One is that human beings started to figure out how to intentionally grow things like grainy grasses. So in this area of the world, it would be wheat and barley. And not only that, but in combination with, they figured out how to domesticate animals like a goat. And so when you put those two together, this created a ample food supply, enough for them to do the second thing, which is to change from a nomadic lifestyle, a moving around lifestyle, where you move around seasonally with whatever food is available, and you stay in one place. And so when we kind of look at the hallmarks of the first agricultural revolution, then that's it. It's the domestication of plants and animals and the switch from a nomadic lifestyle to a stationary one, to what we call a sedentary one. They become farmers. All right, the second agricultural revolution. This is going to happen primarily in Europe. And when we say Europe, we mean mostly Northern and Western Europe. We will see that the United States takes part in this. Places like Japan and Australia will be, more or less involved in the second agricultural revolution. And this is going to happen from 1650 to roughly 1950. Now, in terms of what really makes these countries a part of the second agricultural revolution, it is improved technology on farms. And there's a few things that seem very simple, but those few things were ingenious. And not only that, but they drastically increased food production so that we had enough food in these places for them to store food in an ample enough way that they could then use their creative talents to innovate and engineer and develop far beyond what basic farmers were doing. And so you can see there on the screen, probably the biggest advances in technology will be crop rotation, the horse collar, some kind of a metal plow, and then rudimentary machines and fertilizers. And so the closer we get to like the 1950s, obviously now we're going to be using mechanized machines of some kind of farm, chemical fertilizers. But in terms of the early part of the second agricultural revolution, when we look at the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s, a couple of things stick out. One is crop rotation. Let's briefly talk about crop rotation. So in crop rotation, what farmers figured out is that if you planted the same thing on the same plot of land year after year, you would get a diminishing return. You would get less productivity each year. So you either had to leave your land fallow, which means you had to leave it just not planted. You had to leave it basically barren. The problem with that is now you're not producing food. So they had to figure out a way that they could continually produce food, but replenish it enough to where they could then use it again to plant their most important thing, which are going to be their grainy grasses, their wheat, their barley, their oats, their rice, millet, sorghum, whatever it was that they could mass produce and store for years and make bread out of. I mean, ostensibly, that's the most important thing. It may not taste great, but it'll keep your belly full. So in that first season of crop rotation, that's what you're gonna plant your grainy grasses. But those inherently deplete the land or your property with nutrients. So you got to revitalize that somehow. And yes, they did start using basic types of fertilizer, but it wasn't always enough. Now, the second crop rotation typically was about adding variety into your diet. So whereas the first season was going to be those grainy grasses, now you're going to introduce in fruits and vegetables and other things like that. But then by then your soil was getting depleted, and so in the third rotation, they figured out how to use the benefits of what are called legumes. So legumes are pod plants, snap peas, edamame, any kind of peanuts, any kind of pod plants that would be a legume. But in Europe in particular, they figured out that certain legumes like alfalfa and clover, not only did they reinvigorate the soil, which was great, but they created a food source for their animals that their animals just loved and was actually really good for them. And the poop that came out of them really fertilized the ground. But the nice thing about that, the clover and the legumes, besides the fact that it reinvigorated the soil, was that it was a non-competing food source between them and the humans. So there are all sorts of kind of benefits. So that's crop rotation. So again, grainy grasses, then you have like fruits and vegetables, and then your legumes. The other ones you can see on the screen, bottom right-hand corner, you have the horse collar and the plow. And even though this is by no means a tractor, think about doing this work on your own without an animal. The animal is much more powerful. The animal doesn't get tired as fast. And this is going to drastically increase the size of your field because you can produce more, you can work more, and food's going to go up. Okay, when we think of the second agricultural revolution, we need to think of what are today the MDCs, because this is really what sort of jumps them ahead in terms of development compared to what we'd call the LDCs today. All right, the third agricultural revolution. This is going on right now, today, and it's going on mainly in what we would call the LDCs. In the 1960s, there was a guy named Norman Borlaug, and not that you ever need to remember him, but why he is famous in history to those people in agriculture is that he's really the first guy that creates a genetically modified organism. And so he did this with wheat, and then with, they started doing it with corn and rice and soybeans. And now, there's an almost unlimited amount of genetically modified organisms. But the reason that he did it was so that these LDCs who are at a geographic disadvantage to growing seed agriculture, so that they could grow some of these things in places where they shouldn't grow. And so what you have to do is you have to genetically alter their DNA structure so that they'll grow in more humid places, or in places in higher elevations, or whatever the case is. But that's what these miracle grains are. Places where maize and wheat and barley and sorghum and millet, if they won't grow along the equator, if you can change their genetic structure, then maybe you can get them to grow there. And so that's, when we talk about miracle grains and GMOs, just know that to some degree, a miracle grain is a GMO, but not all GMOs are miracle grains. So today in class, I was eating a Cosmic Crisp apple. That's a genetically modified organism. There's no such thing in nature as a Cosmic Crisp apple. So just know that they are separate things, but that the miracle grains are the types of grainy grasses, the wheat, the barley, the oats, the rice, things like that have their DNA structure altered so that these LDCs can start growing mass-producing foods so that they can develop and do other things. And that's what we're seeing in the third agricultural revolution, is that these LDCs are starting to get that technology. Okay, another thing that AP might ask you in terms of an introduction to agriculture would be animal and plant hearths. And so I'm just going to kind of go from one map to the other. If we take a look there, and I know it's not really, really clear, but we want to know some major hearths. And so in terms of seed hearths, the Middle East, you're talking your barley and your wheat and your oats and rye. If you're going to Asia, it's going to be mostly rice. If you go to kind of that eastern part where Ethiopia is, in sub-Saharan Africa, really you're talking about millet and sorghum. And then in Latin America, you can see there in Central America, like where Mexico is today, maize is the big one, but then you have some other ones, tomatoes, certain things like that are those seed agriculture. In terms of vegetative ones, so vegetative ones are going to be kind of along the equator. So in that area of Indonesia, taro would be a big one. In Africa, it would be cassava or yams, what we would call sweet potatoes. And then in Latin America, you're talking about things that are like cassava, and the potato would be a big one there. So those are vegetative hearths. Now, over on the right side, you can see those animal hearths. And I think important ones to point out, we think, for example, like chickens and pigs, for the most part, came from Asia. There's some debate whether the pigs actually came from the Middle East. Cattle, we think, definitely came in the area of India and the Middle East. The horse definitely came above the Caspian Sea. And if you kind of look over towards North America and Latin America and South America, really we don't have a beast of burden. There are some animals that were useful, but for the most part, they weren't beasts of burden. All right, next topic. And these are a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try to do my best to really explain them to you. So pay attention as you fill them out. So you're going to see the words extensive and intensive, subsistence, and commercial. And so when we add these four combination of words together, it describes a type of agriculture. All right, so the first one is extensive. Extensive means over a large area, okay? Extensive means over a large area. Typically speaking, with extensive agriculture, you're not putting in a lot of work to get out what you're getting out, all right? Whereas intensive, typically speaking, you're having to put a lot more work in, and more or less, you're probably not getting out as much as you would, per worker. But just for the sake of your sanity, when you're doing these cards, think of extensive over a large area. When we talk about subsistence, we're talking about our output is not that big, and we're not feeding a lot of people. So put those two together: extensive over a large area, subsistence, we're not producing a whole lot. That's extensive subsistence agriculture. Okay, now there's a major type of extensive subsistence agriculture, and that is called shifting cultivation. Now, the primary form of shifting cultivation in the world is slash and burn. And I really don't care if you have two separate terms. You can put these on the same term. Really what shifting cultivation means is that you're moving, you're not sedentary, you're moving in. So maybe you farm in one area for a couple of years, then you move and you farm in another area, and then you move, and then you farm in another area. So you're not doing crop rotation. You're basically just using the soil up, going to a different place, using the soil up, going to a different place. That generically is shifting cultivation. Now, almost exclusively in the world today, the major type of shifting cultivation is called slash and burn cultivation. And we typically see this in like rainforests. And so in a rainforest, it's very difficult to farm. Obviously, there's not a lot of sunshine coming into a rainforest because the canopy up above doesn't let sunshine in. Now, there's plenty of rain, but that's the problem. There's almost too much rain. There's not a lot of topsoil. The vegetation grows in very shallow topsoil. And so this is just not very good areas for farming naturally. So what you have to do is you have to not only get the sunshine to come down to the ground, but then you also have to kind of make sure that you fertilize the ground so stuff will grow. So what people in, say, the Amazon rainforest do is they will burn down a section of the forest the best they can, and then you'll see, like in the middle picture, then there's kind of nothing left but stumps. That what's called potash. The potash is the black stuff that you see. That stuff has been burned, and that stuff has a high content of carbon and nitrogen in it, two things that are very critical in the growing of crops. And so what we find is that this area, once it's burned, that black stuff makes for really good fertilizer. The problem is it's a one-time fertilizer, and after this, then you're going to get diminishing returns. And these people don't practice crop rotation, so they'll plant in between those stumps. They'll plant for a couple of years, and then their land will become virtually useless, and they'll have to shift, and that's where it's called shifting cultivation. They'll burn down another section of forest. They'll do the process all over again. After 3 or 4 years, they have to shift again, do it again. And by the time they come back, 15, 20 years later from where they originally started, it's grown back. And as long as there's a small population, this is a viable way to live. They don't produce a ton of food, but they typically grow enough to live. And that's why people in these rainforests, they have done it. They've practiced shifting cultivation because typically speaking, it makes enough food to live. You're not going to have a big population this way. It's probably not the most comfortable way to live, but it doesn't take a lot of work, which is kind of why it's extensive, but you don't get a lot of output either, which is why it's subsistence. But it is a viable way to live, and people have been doing it for thousands of years. Okay, and I can't remember if we have, just as a note, if there is a key term called a SWIDDEN. I don't think you really need an entire key term for this. Don't bother. Just know that if you hear that terminology on a test or something like that, this area that you see in the pictures where it's been burned, where the potash comes down, that is called the SWIDDEN, the cleared area. Okay, pastoral nomadism. This is another example, again, let me go back, of extensive subsistence agriculture. And this is shifting, kind of a shifting cultivation. These people are moving quite a bit. So pastoral nomadism is when we herd animals, and typically it's a small herd. You're probably talking about less than 50 animals, probably even as few as like 10 or so, like that. So it's the herding of animals, sheep, goats, yaks, camels, oxen, and moving them seasonally wherever there's food and water available. Now, typically speaking, in the summertime, it gets too hot for the animals, so you move them up in elevation. And up there is going to be a little source of water, probably some summer grass up in the higher elevations, and it's cooler for these animals. But then in the wintertime, it becomes too cool. There's not enough water, and so you go down in elevation. You keep repeating this, what we call circulation migration, seasonally from lower elevations to higher elevations. And so we call this transhumance. All right, so it's a type of pastoral nomadism, a type of circulation migration where you're going back and forth, low elevation to high elevation, low elevation to high elevation, and that is called transhumance migration. Today, whereas slash and burn is probably practiced mostly in rainforests along the equator, pastoral nomadism is typically not only in LDCs, we primarily see it in LDCs, but in various deserts, Kalahari Desert, what is called the steppe climate. So you can see right there in the picture, that's a steppe climate. So it's near desert. Just think of the steppes or the steeps, however you want to pronounce it. They are not quite desert, but they're not far from it either. Savannas of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the interior of Asia, the Deccan Plateau. These are all areas where we see transhumance and pastoral nomadism. So remember that transhumance is a type of pastoral nomadism. If you are not going up and down in elevation, then it's just pastoral nomadism and just kind of circulation migration. But if you're going up and down, up and down, up and down, season to season, then that is called transhumance, pastoral nomadism. Okay, now we're going to switch over to another type of subsistence agriculture, but now we're going to be putting in a lot more work. So if we go back, it's not a whole lot of work. The animals mostly just kind of walk on their own, and really all you have to do is milk them occasionally. You have to kind of herd them with your stick or with a small animal, but it's not a whole lot of work. It's just that you don't get out a lot of product. Now you're going to be putting in a lot of work and still not getting out a lot of product. And I would somewhat argue the picture that I have here, you're probably getting a little more, but if you look, you sure don't see machines doing this work. What you see there really is intensive subsistence agriculture. So intensive, now we're putting in a lot more work, but subsistence, we're not getting a ton of output, okay? So let me say that one more time. As opposed to extensive, where we're doing it over a large area, we're probably not putting in a ton of work, but we're not getting a lot out. Intensive subsistence agriculture, now we're working really hard, but we're still not getting a lot out. Okay, and if you're wondering, well, why would you do that? Well, it's kind of your geography. You're kind of forced to do what your geography has you do. And really, if you're having to put a large amount of work in, you're only going to be able to cover, a certain amount of space. So whereas in America, you would see a tractor doing the work of all these people, in Asia, where they're doing this rice farming, you're seeing a lot of human beings doing a lot of work by hand, okay? And this particular type of rice farming is called wet rice dominant. So we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. You don't really have to have a definition for wet rice dominant, but that just means that pretty much throughout the entire year, they're rice farming and they're doing it with a lot of water. You can see here that they're doing a technique called terracing. And again, if we have a key term for terracing, it's okay. I don't think you necessarily need an entire key term for terracing and sawa and all these things. I think really you just need to kind of know what they are. Okay, I'm not really worried that you have key terms for them. So let me explain the picture that you see there. First of all, you see people doing a lot of work. That's the intensive part. Because they don't have machines, you're going to get more subsistence. That's the subsistence part. The area that is flooded, okay, that is called the sawa. Now, Americans typically call this a rice paddy, but technically it's called a sawa. All right, so I think that's, what is that? That's SAWAH. A sawa is the flooded part of the rice paddy. Okay, and terracing just means, hey, look, they didn't have a flat part. They need a lot of rain for something like rice farming. You've got to, you got to plant the shoots down in there, and then you got to pretty much have a standing thing of water. Rice takes a lot of water, which is why you don't typically see it in places like America. We have very few areas that have this much water, and a rainforest is one of them. So this would be an example of something where we're not shifting, right? This is they plant here and they do it each year, but they've terraced the land. They've made these levels on which they can then flood the area so the water doesn't flood down the hill. Okay, and there you can see, I'll just give you a chance to kind of read that there. But what that woman is doing is she's preparing rice shoots. She'll kind of tie them together with a reed, like just one of the rice things. And then she'll take that brown part that you see at the bottom there, and she'll sink that down into the ground. And that's, at the ends, at the top part, that's where the rice is going to be. Now, rice compared to wheat is a lot of work. I mean, it's all a lot of work when you're farming, but rice farming is especially hard work. Okay, I can't remember if we have it on our key terms or not, but we're going to run into these terms anyways. So you're going to hear like double cropping and triple cropping and things like that. Double cropping means, if you can see on there as you read down there, double cropping means that you can get 2 harvests per year. Triple cropping would mean that you could get 3 harvests per year. Typically speaking, in America, unless you have a greenhouse, you're going to get 1 harvest per year. It's just monocropping or single cropping. Okay? But in these places where they get rain all year, then you're going to get double cropping and triple cropping. And if you're able to have an irrigation system, your chances of double cropping and triple cropping are better. And you want to do this because then you're going to be able to make more food. But what really allows them to do this is that it's warm all year. If the weather is cold, then you probably can't do this. Okay, next, extensive commercial agriculture. So now remember, we're doing this over a large area. We're not putting in a ton of work, but because it's commercial, we're getting a pretty large output, okay? And so if you look at like a big old cattle ranch, I mean, you're going to have hundreds of cows, maybe even possibly thousands of cows. And I mean, look how many farmers there are. Look how many, ranch hands there are. There's like less than 5. And this is done over a large area, but look at all the cows. They're going to have a lot of output. So anytime that you're going to feed more than a couple of people, you're going to think about what you're going to be doing with the rest of those cows. You're not just using them for yourselves. You're going to be selling them. Now, that's what makes it commercial. So if you don't understand the basic difference between subsistence agriculture and commercial agriculture, subsistence agriculture means you're only productive enough to grow for yourself or your family. You don't have enough to sell, or you have very little to sell. Whereas with a commercial type of agriculture, you intend to sell most of what you make. You may use some of it, but then you're going to sell 95% of it. The other thing we typically see with commercial agriculture today is something called monoculture, okay? And I know that is a key term, so we'll cover it another place when we do something else, but monoculture means that you plant the same crop over a large area. So you can see like on the bottom right-hand picture, that is wheat or what's left of wheat. And they planted it literally as far as the eye can see. That's called monoculture. And typically today, commercial farms are mostly monoculture. All right. So use, the large cattle ranch in, I think is in Colorado, or the wheat farm in Texas that you see on the right. But those are good examples of extensive commercial agriculture over a large area. They're not putting in a ton of work, but they're getting high output. All right, and then the last one is called intensive commercial agriculture. Plantations can be intensive commercial agriculture. So if we have like a sugar cane or an avocado or coffee plantation, those will be intensive commercial agriculture. But typically, what makes it intensive is that it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of capital or labor or something like that to make it go. If you look at like that dairy farm that's on the right, that's a lot more work than your cattle ranch that's on the left. Okay, there. So these are things where the capital costs are high and or the labor costs are high. You're going to be putting out a lot of work for what you're getting out. But keep in mind, it is commercial. So even though the input costs are high or the labor costs are going to be high, you're also selling quite a bit. And as a result, then that's why it's the commercial agriculture. Okay. So if you need to during class, you can ask me the difference between extensive and intensive. But just remember, extensive, usually over a large area of land, relatively speaking, your inputs are going to be lower. And if it's subsistence, then you're not making a lot. If it's commercial, then you're making a lot. You're going to sell it. If it's intensive, you're putting in a lot more labor to do it. If it's intensive subsistence, which is probably the worst, then you're putting in a lot of work and you're not getting much out. If it's intensive commercial, then you're still putting in a lot of labor, but at least you're being able to sell it. And again, it's not like you can definitely choose these. It's kind of what your geography dictates. I mean, you could have a dairy farm, but if you're along the equator, the cows aren't going to live very well. They just don't grow very well or live very well in most of the equatorial areas. Okay, that should be it for our introduction to agriculture. Thank you for tuning in and have a good day.